This week marks the midpoint of the class, so we'll be shifting gears and taking a look at the development of another complex society, the classic Maya. We'll also have a few lectures on the Aztec and some indigenous cultures in North America. There are many indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica, and we're focusing primarily on just two of them, so keep in mind there are many more, most of which are still existing cultural groups. People have been in the Americas for at least 11,000 years, but some recent evidence suggests that the Americas may have been settled as early as 30,000 years ago. Between 5,000 and 11,000 years ago, intense plant domestication began all over the Americas, including squash and peppers 10,000 years ago, cotton at 5,000 years ago, potatoes at 7,000 years ago, corn from 9 to 7,000 years ago, and beans at 4,000 years ago. Again, this is happening in other places around the world around this time, perhaps due to increased moisture in the environment with the melting of the glaciers in the last glacial maximum, the last ice age. Corn was certainly the hardest of these plants to domesticate, because it has the tendency to relapse to its wild form with any exposure to the wild version, and it is also extremely sensitive to environmental changes, so spreading it as far north as modern-day New York State took thousands of years and a lot of patience. As for animal domesticates, there were guinea pigs in Central America, several types of alpaca and llama-type animals in South America, Muscovy ducks, turkeys, and possibly a now extinct bird called the great auk in North America. Dogs were brought with humans to the Americas, though domestication continued. As a general rule in animal domestication, animal species that follow a leader when startled are able to be domesticated because you can replace that leader, but you probably cannot domesticate animals that scatter when startled. The environment in Mesoamerica is very different than that of the Near East. There are many mountains which are hard to traverse, making trade in foodstuffs unlikely since travel took so long, food would have gone bad on the journey. Natural resources are scattered, as you can see from the map in the reading section. There are also highlands and lowlands, and since all of Mesoamerica is essentially a large block of limestone with a thin layer of earth on top of it, there are no major rivers and most fresh water comes from small streams, a few lakes, and cenotes, which are sinkholes in the limestone that fill with water. Because our class looks at the development of complexity in states, we'll start looking at Mesoamerica, and Mayan people in particular, around 1500 BC or BCE. Archaeologists tend to refer to three major stages of Mayan culture. The period from 1500 BCE to 500 BCE is called the formative or pre-classic period, followed by the classic period from 0 to 1000 AD or Common Era, and then the collapse or post-classic period from 1000 to 1697 AD CE. Of course, these titles heavily suggest that we think that the classic period is the best and brightest period of Mayan cultural history, and everything else is just leading up to it or falling from it. So let's turn first to the formative or pre-classic period. One of the cultures that existed during this period and may have influenced later Mayan culture is the Olmec. At this point in time, Olmec villages were beginning to get bigger and more concentrated and beginning to carve monuments. The Olmec were not one united governmental group, or even really what we recognize as city-states, since their towns were not that large, but they do appear to be small chiefdoms led by some sort of centralized leader. These chiefs or leaders seem to be in contact with one another, and one of the items they traded over astoundingly long and difficult paths are massive carved stone head monuments. Since there is no stone where any of the main Olmec towns were located, the stone itself had to be brought in from elsewhere or carved on site and then transported to its final destination. Our questions here are, why would people work so hard on transporting such a heavy object so far for someone else? And for what purposes would these heads be carved and exchanged between chiefs? From the stone carvings we have in Olmec towns, it seems that many chiefs came to power through some association with the gods. For a long time, archaeologists believed that these towns were really only religious centers, but now we are not sure about this because Mesoamerican lowlands are rainforest environments, and anything that isn't made out of stone tends to get consumed. However, we do have these stone carvings, and we can see that some symbols appear across various Olmec towns. We see many sculptures of humans that are half human, half animal, or more likely in the process of shape-shifting. We know that in many Mesoamerican religions, shamanism is practiced, and a key aspect of that belief system is communication with the spirit world and transformation into an animal, sometimes literally, sometimes through a trance where you can see through an animal's eyes. One example of this comes from Olmec paintings at Otohtitlan in a cave, where there is a depiction of animal-human transformation. One of the paintings shows a person in either bird costume or in the act of turning into a bird. Caves themselves are important sites for a similar reason, as they serve as a portal between worlds or states of being, and are often conceived as the mouths of gods. We see one example of this at La Venta, a major Olmec site. Here there is a carving of a man emerging from what appears to be a cave, indicating that he might be a religious figure. Since these transforming figures are depicted in stone carvings and paintings, being memorialized and aggrandized, we assume they had some sort of power or authority such that other people were willing to do this labor for them. The La Venta site has several other interesting features. It has a huge earth mound and several small mounds, as well as stone mosaics inlaid into the ground and featuring greenstone, which is quite similar to jade, which had to have been imported from at least 70 to 80 miles away. Another artifact found not far from La Venta reveals even more about complexity in Olmec societies. During a modern construction project, a greenstone slab was found covered in hieroglyphic symbols. Dubbed the Cascajal block, it may represent the earliest known writing form in the Americas. Several of the symbols reappear among the Maya during the Classic period, but others we have only found here on this slab. Around 500 BC or BCE, the Olmec chiefdoms seem to disperse. Statues and monuments stop appearing, and around this time some of the statues seem to have been vandalized. We're not sure why this dispersal happens, but given the damage to statues made in the image of people we've assumed to be leaders of some sort, there may have been a backlash against those leaders for some reason. At this point, we say that the formative or pre-classic period ended, and a few hundred years later, around 0 AD, the beginning of the Common Era, we say that the Classic period begins. The Classic period consists mostly of Maya people and states, though at least one site was of a non-Mayan cultural group, likely either the Toltec or Totonac, and was a major trade center that interacted with the Mayan centers. We deem this the Classic period because, from our perspective, it seems like the height of civilization and culture, but of course we haven't asked the many Maya people alive today if they agree with that assumption. During the Classic period, it seems that populations rose and became concentrated again, which necessitated more innovations in food production. With no major rivers and so no major floodplains, two main modes of agriculture develop, chinampas and slash and burn. Chinampas are floating gardens, where you take earth from a marsh, which is fed by a small mountain stream, and pile the dirt in squares, which leaves water channels between these raised squares. It takes constant work for the raised squares not to collapse into the water, but it's a highly effective way of farming due to the fertile soil. Slash and burn, also known as Swidden agriculture, has a bad reputation because today it is done in an unsustainable way. But if done correctly, it's actually environmentally friendly and sustainable. What you do is take a plot of land and burn it, putting nutrients into the soil. You plant there for several years, then leave the land alone to heal and grow back. You move to another plot and do the same thing. By the time you get back around to that first plot of land, it's regrown and you can burn it again. The process can be very destructive if you don't have adequate time for the land to replenish itself, but it seems that it was effective for the Maya for hundreds of years as they developed increasingly large populations. Gathered in these population centers, the Maya of the Classic period developed a complex written language, which we've largely deciphered, mathematical concepts, including the number 0, which allows for architectural developments, huge stone structures, and astronomy. We can see that early on, small mounds and stone ziggurats were built and later larger ones emerged. Sometimes they would even add expansions onto the existing ziggurats. These monuments had people living on top of them who seemed to be priests or ritual practitioners of some sort. They are marked by a written symbol which we translate to the word ahau. However, studying the skeletal remains of ahau throughout the Classic period reveals something archaeologists wouldn't expect. These noblemen, who appear to be living in the best residences with the most elaborate clothes and the most prized possessions, were in worse physical health than the farmers living around their monuments. Unlike the priests in early Near Eastern city-states, these religious figures who appear to be nobility of some sort were not getting as many nutrients and simply had less food than their so-called lower-class followers. How can this be the case? That's the question we'll answer together in the next lecture on performances of power, trade, and imagined communities.